About 40 public servants today stormed into the Arbitration Commission where their pay case was being heard. They chanted and held up placards demanding wage justice. But as industrial roundsman Vic Caruso reports, it was an orderly protest.
Members of two unions turned up on the steps of Nauru House for the lunchtime demonstration.
What do we want? Wage justice! When do we want it? Now!
The Australian Public Service Association and the Administrative and Clerical Officers Association have 25,000 members between them in the state. But only 40-odd turned up. They want a 12% pay rise, which is being opposed by the federal government, which has intervened in the pay case.
The federal government's got a right to intervene, that's clear under the law, but it's the nature of the intervention that concerns us.
What is that nature?
They will be arguing for maximum restraint in the Commonwealth sector, and that's in breach of an agreement that they made with us last July. You'll recall the telecom dispute last July. One of the processes of resolving that dispute was an agreement that our wages would be set in fair comparison with outside wages.
The demonstrators then went inside, taking the lifts to the 39th floor of Nauru House, where the Arbitration Commission has been hearing their case on and off since April. Being a public hearing, anyone is allowed in, though judges don't take too kindly to an over-effusive display of verbal and written interest. The target of their protest was the federal government, represented by Dr. Gavin Griffith. He was due to give his submission this afternoon. When the afternoon session began, the head of the full bench, Mr. Justice Williams, cautioned the demonstrators. He said that unless they put down their placards and remain silent, he'd adjourn the hearing. The demonstrators put down their placards and the hearing continued without incident. Vic Caruso, Eyewitness News.
Placard-waving, shouting demonstrators today. The protesters were angry at the federal government for intervening in their pay claim. Nick McCallum reports they believe the intervention could lead to industrial chaos.
What do we want? Wage justice! And when do we want? Now!
The demonstrators, members of the two public service unions, began their protest outside Nauru House as the full bench reconvened to hear their 12% pay claim. The white-collar public servants believe the federal government's opposition to their claim is in breach of an agreement. They maintain the government promised last year to allow them wage levels comparable to the private sector. As the government advocates arrived, the protesters moved into the court on the 39th floor and vetted their anger.
What do we want? Wage justice! When do we want it? Now!
But it was the head of the four-man bench, Mr. Justice Williams, who then expressed his anger.
If you demonstrate or show signs such as you're showing now, you'll simply delay the hearing.
At that threat, the demonstrators calmed down and listened peacefully. They don't expect a result from the case for some time, but believe today's action helped their cause considerably.
Dr. Gavin Griffith QC said such a rise would cost the government an extra $240 million. He said if there were to be an increase, it should be small and it should be a flat rise. Dr. Griffith said today the government had intervened because of the economic consequences of a large rise for 112,000 public servants, and the expected flow-ons were serious. It was earlier disrupted by a demonstration of public servants.
During the hearing's lunch break, about 50 public servants demonstrated outside the Arbitration Commission at Nauru House over the federal government's intervention in their pay case. Public service unions say the federal government's opposition to their claim would mean that the pay of some lower-level public servants would remain below the poverty line. Just before the afternoon hearing was due to start, the protesters came upstairs and filed into the court to hear the federal government submission opposing any rise at all for white-collar public servants. When the bench returned to the court, the protesters stood on their feet, lifted their placards and chanted that they wanted wage justice. Mr. Justice Williams then cautioned them, saying he'd heard their comments and seen their placards, but if they misbehaved, they'd just further delay the hearing. He then asked the Administrative and Clerical Officers Association's Federal Industrial Officer, Mr. Les Ayres, to see if he could make his members behave. He said if they continued to misbehave, he'd simply adjourn the hearing.
Scenes outside the Arbitration Commission in Melbourne today, when a small but vocal group of public servants protested the federal government's intervention in their wage case. The demonstrators were warned that the hearing would be adjourned if they continued to disrupt the proceedings.
The white-collar public servants who did give up their lunchtime gathered in the city to protest against the government's power to disallow arbitration decisions in the public service. The workers are angry that the government stepped in on the 10th day of their arbitration hearing for a 12% pay claim. Although the government says it intervened on the grounds of public interest because of the possible economic repercussions that granting the claim would have, the Administrative Clerical Officers Association State Secretary David Bunn says the government has gone back on a long-standing deal with public sector unions.
We got agreement from the government that fair comparisons of our wages with outside wages would be done and would be the basis for fixing wages in the Commonwealth. Now today in the court, the Commonwealth is going to argue against that. It's going to argue for an artificial restraint on their own workers' wages.
The Public Service Board, however, has offered the 100,000 workers increases of between 5.1 and 8.7%. These offers range from $11.50 to about $90 at the highest level. Sandy Kay for O28 News, Melbourne.
National Secretary of ACOA, the Administrative and Clerical Officers Association. Mr Munro, could I suggest to you that it's a right and proper thing for you to follow the politician's example and reduce your claims to 7%, not the 12% that you're arguing for on Monday?
I think our difficulty, Richard, is that we've followed the example for some years, dating back to 1974, when Mr McPhee talks of putting the lid on us. Well, the lid's been on. And what we're really seeking now is to, I suppose, keep in contact with the rest of the community. Our rates are requiring something of the order of 9 to 13% to match what the politicians have got in this last round of increases. That's what we're after. We're not really trying to start any new round. We're trying to overcome the lag that has developed.
Yeah, but I mean, everyone argues that really, Mr Munro, don't they? I mean, which came first, the chicken or the egg?
Well, I think that we can place beyond any doubt our average weekly earnings don't lie. Our movement relative to that area demonstrates a need for increases of upwards of 12%.
But
the board, and I think even the government, if I could say this, Richard, in the last week have put to the Commission that it should ignore what it calls the dispassionate facts. And so it's not us arguing. Surveys have been conducted that show our members are significantly behind community movement, up to $30 a week.
Mr Munro, let me interrupt you and ask, should not public servants really be the first ones to start setting the example, if there is an example to be set, given that you've got security of tenure? You can't be sacked.
Well, I think the security of tenure notion is nonsense, particularly for members who are being thrown out of work in areas such as Medibank, in Australia Post and quite a number of the statutory authorities. They're just as vulnerable to retrenchment, redundancy as anyone else. Secondly, as I've said, and I hope people understand, the example has already been set. We're not leaders. We're well behind, and you're not talking about people who are well off. There are people who are within the poverty line parameters. ACOS, for instance, says that the poverty line's around $213 a week. The Institute of Applied Economic and Social Research says it's around $220. We've got members who are seeking $20 to $30 a week, which puts them in line with community movement elsewhere, and they're on rates less than that. Some of them are on 200, some of them are on 220 a week. That's nonsense to be talking about people taking example. They're working poor, and they'll be kept that way.
Do you accept the argument of Mr Dolan, the ACTU president, that it's either less pay or lose your jobs?
I don't think in relation to this particular area. Mr Dolan's remarks go to wage movement over the coming year. And I think Mr Crean's made it plain that the aspirations of the union movement are that people who are in the workforce don't lose ground relative to inflation. Now, in our case, what we say is that we should at least keep pace with the community movement that has occurred over the past 18 months, even with the politicians. We'll settle for what the politicians have received in the last year. They've got 27%. Our members have got 9%.
Mr Munro, thank you very much indeed.
The public servants' pay rise, and already unions are threatening retaliatory action, industrial action, to win a bigger increase. They're angry and disgusted with the Arbitration Commission, which sliced their 13% claim in half. Postal workers who get an automatic flow-on will strike if they can't get more, and the public servants will consider their position next week. Industrial Roundsman Vic Caruso has this report.
Public servants have been after a pay rise since February this year. They carried out surveys to show that their wages had fallen behind those of comparable jobs in the private sector. But what really swayed the Commission was the federal government, which argued for wage restraint. The government said there should be no increase, or a small one, if any. The award covers 112,000 workers, a third of the federal public service in all departments, from the lowest clerk to the so-called fat cats at the top. They got between 5.9 and 6.7%, even less than what the Public Service Board, their employer, originally offered them, and they rejected as too low. They put exhaustive cases to the full bench of the Commission. It took a long time to hear the case, and that's why the unions were shocked by today's decision. They accused the Commission of becoming an arm of government policy.
Well, it appears to us that it's a blatantly political decision. They have indicated that they wish to go the way of the federal government and have public service clerks be the ones who exercise wage restraint because of the economic mess that the government has put us in.
The more immediate threat of industrial action comes from 18,000 postal workers. They've been waiting since February for the outcome of the case because their own wages are tied to the public servants' rates. 6% is too low, and unless Australia Post just about doubles it, a strike looks certain. This case really demonstrates why many of Australia's 300 unions are losing faith in the Arbitration Commission and preferring the speedier collective bargaining. It's taken 7 long months for the Commission to process this one claim. You won't be in a hurry to come back to the Commission with another wage claim?
I don't think anyone's in a hurry to come back to a kangaroo court of Malcolm Fraser's.
Vic Caruso at the Arbitration Commission for
112,000 federal white-collar public servants. The decision sparked an angry reaction from unions which had sought a 12% increase. They said the full claim was needed to bring rates into line with rises recently granted to other federal government workers.
The wage rise granted by the Commission represents only a slight improvement on an offer by the Public Service Board, which was rejected by the unions in July this year. While the bench didn't accept the federal government's argument that it should seriously consider not granting any wage rise at all, the bench has accepted the federal government's assessment of the effects that a 12% wage rise would have on the economy.
The bench said it reached its decision after taking into account the present economic situation outlined by the federal government and the obvious need for wage restraint. It said it would be inappropriate to lift wage rates back to the high position in the market range of rates paid to white-collar workers that Commonwealth public servants occupied last December, because it said it could lead to a circular round of wage rises, which would increase inflation. The increases range from about $13 a week to about $43, with an average rise of about $19. The rises will also flow to about 18,000 Australia Post employees.
The decision sparked an angry reaction by unions. While the unions can seek another wage rise in 6 months, they said they'd think twice before they'd take a major wage claim back to the Arbitration Commission.
I've put to the Commission this time that there has never been, since 1966 metal trades, such a long, drawn-out case on a very simple argument. And how we progress is a matter for membership to determine, but we won't eagerly be coming back to a place like this that amounts to a kangaroo court for Malcolm Fraser.